Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to Into the Woods. This is normally the Patreon bonus podcast where I do a deep dive into this week's story. This one is going to go out to everyone, though, and I'll explain why in a moment. The latter half of the episode will be exclusive to patrons. So if you are a patron and you are not listening to the Patreon private feed, just know that there'll be a cutoff about halfway through. So if you want to catch the end, check that out. I'm going to get a little personal, so we'll keep that part just for the patrons. And I know a lot of people don't like it when I do these publicly because you don't, it's not what you ask for. You didn't sign up to be a patron to hear this stuff. If that's you, please just stop listening. Remove this episode from your up next. Please don't leave nasty reviews and comments on my show because I'm not trying to force you to listen to these. These are really just there for the people who are interested in hearing it. So if that's not you, it's fine. Just walk away. Okay, so this story was called The Warning Woods, and I could tell that confused a few people at first. I'm assuming before they listened to the story, and I will fully acknowledge that as I was publishing it, I was like, is this a good idea? As I was titling, the podcast and the YouTube video and stuff like that, realizing it could be a little confusing. So hopefully it makes sense now. I've really been plotting this since well before Halloween. I'm trying to think. It was probably, I don't know, early October or so. And it all stems back to this giant kind of concept that came to me one night just while I was sitting around with my family. And I had to grab my phone real quick and start writing notes. And it was the strangest experience. I have story ideas all the time where I'll get a little snippet of a story, maybe a scene or an ending or a cool character. And what usually happens is I'll write that into my phone as a note. And if I'm lucky, my mind kind of keeps working on it over the next few minutes, and I'll write down a few more notes here and there. And occasionally I'll even end up with a fully fleshed out story within, 5 to 10 minutes of just thinking about it. I can kind of form an outline. This was the first and only time I've ever had this experience where I had basically the complete concept, not of the plot of this story per se, but of what the Warning Woods are, what they're connected to, how this whole parallel dimension thing works, how it explains all these different types of supernatural and paranormal entities that have appeared in the show. It all kind of hit me in a second, kind of like, the theory of like the Big Bang, where it's like this little speck and all of a sudden, boom, the whole universe is there somehow. That's what it felt like in my mind. It was like I had there was like a click and just, it was all there. Never had it happen before, never have had it happen since, which is probably good because this has basically been what my entire mind has been occupied with since October. Obviously, I've still been, writing other stories while thinking of this, but this episode has been a long time in the making. And part of the reason I waited so long was just because I wanted to give myself time. It was really convenient that everything appeared sort of at once, but I really wanted to spend some time fleshing out the concept, testing the concept. I started while watching mainstream horror movies, going to the theater and seeing things, watching stuff at home. I started kind of testing this concept against those movies. I would be like, well, okay, let's apply my Warning Woods theory to this world that this movie's happening in. And it worked like every time. You could kind of explain whatever the entity in the movie was by this parallel dimension where things have to cross over and take a form here. And we'll talk more about that in a few minutes. But the other reason it took so long is because I did kind of set in my mind that it's sort of a big moment in the show. And I wanted it to happen at a significant time. I didn't want to release it on like November 17th or whatever. I wanted it to be tied to something significant. So in this case, I knew the new year was approaching and decided that was going to be my goal, to have it be the New Year's episode. And that's a little significant for another reason too, because the last time I brought out a recurring character was the New Year's episode last year, where we had Gabby Pons and the Whitney brothers visiting the Hotel Moss and helping rid it of some evil there. And at the end of that episode, I did not retire Gabby Pons, but I made it clear she was stepping away for a little while. I think I've done 3 stories with her total. Maybe a 4th? I don't know. I kind of lost track, but I'd done 3 with her, a couple of them fairly close together, and kind of the same thing with the Whitney brothers. I brought them back a few times in 2023, and they also kind of took a pause after that New Year's episode. And honestly, I felt like with kind of the triple episode with the Hotel Moss, Gabby Pons, and the Whitney brothers, I feel like I'm trying to think of how to word it, but like it felt significant in a way that I wasn't prepared for, and I didn't want to bring any of the characters from that story back just willy-nilly. I didn't want to do it without a real purpose, because I kind of felt like I was beginning to build towards something. The first time there was any acknowledgement that these stories could be happening in the same universe was with Gabby Pons and the Whitney brothers. So, it was a good moment to kind of take a break and say, okay, well, what does this mean that it's all connected? And that was well before I even had this idea. Crystal Jennings, we have not seen since the 2023 Halloween special, The Owl. So bringing her back for the first time is something that has been asked of me. Basically, ever since The Owl came out, people have wanted more Crystal Jennings. And there was such a loud cry for more Crystal Jennings that it's kind of similar to what I just mentioned. I really felt a need to pause, think about who she's going to be in this world, so that the next story she appears in, which ended up being this one, it's really meaningful towards the larger picture of the Warning Woods. And really, ever since this podcast started to become somewhat popular, I've struggled with the name not really being connected to anything. It all goes back to, and if you've been listening for a while, I'm sure you've heard me mention this or talk about it, because I've talked about it with some other people on their podcasts as well. Basically, I wanted this podcast to be my outlet as I practiced writing. I was in the middle of writing my first novel, The Collins House. I had no idea what I was doing. I had never written a novel. I'd really never even written a short story besides like stuff for high school or whatever. And the amount of effort you put into something like that is completely different than something that you're going to share publicly. And so I wanted to basically practice. I wanted to write these short stories, and in today's kind of hustle culture, of course I was like, well, how could I make money off of all that time I'm going to put into it? So that was kind of what started the podcast. And then I had this idea of, because I was walking through the woods when I had the idea, and was kind of, you're like listening for animals and stuff like that. And I was like, there's a lot of warnings in the woods. There's a lot of little signs and things to look out for. Why don't I call this podcast The Warning Woods? And the whole thing will be like every story is going to have some kind of warning about something to watch out for, or like a behavior to avoid or something like that. Kind of corny, not really what I ended up doing. I abandoned that almost immediately. And ever since, the name hasn't really had a meaning. So when people ask me why it's called The Warning Woods, I have to basically tell that whole story to explain it, because it just doesn't make sense otherwise. So I've always wanted to find a way to give the name of the show a little more weight. And obviously, I think we did that with this story, making the Morning Woods an actual physical place and also sort of the center of this wider world of the Morning Woods. That was way too many W's. I was in the middle of saying it and I hated it. But you know what I'm saying. It's all about the big picture at this point, and it all kind of comes back to the Morning Woods. So let's talk about some of the finer details of the story, and in doing so, we'll explore some of the concepts that are outlined here. So Jennings finally meets this guy who calls her at the end of The Owl, this mysterious HPA guy who tells her a little bit about what may have caused the owl to appear, tells her a little bit about the HPA, and then offers a job at the end. So since then, it's been quiet for Jennings. So she's still back. Like the owl took place in 2020. So that's where we left her in 2020. So this story also kind of served as a way to bring her into our present day, because I usually tend to write in the present day. So she's back there in 2020. She's just had this phone call with this guy who offers this position. I don't know how many of you did the math on the dates, but essentially, there was like a couple months where she was, probably still serving as the chief of police in Prouty, dealing with that transition. And then January of 2021 begins her training, which 4 months in is interrupted by Commander Graham, who turns out to be the guy who called her on the phone. So if you have not listened to The Owl, or if you just needed a quick refresher, that's how we get to the beginning of this story. So Graham pulls her out of training, puts her on a plane, won't tell her where they're going. That actually is I sort of borrowed the whole mysterious plane ride thing from a book that I just read for some of me and my dad friends have a book club. And it's called Lost Horizon by James Hilton. It's a fantastic book. I would highly recommend. Not a horror book, not a scary book, but fascinating. One of those books that is just ripe with lots of topics for discussion. So, but anyway, that book, it also kind of, there's like a prologue, but then it opens with these people on this plane ride kind of figuring out that they don't really know where they're going. So I borrowed that a little bit. Just wanting to acknowledge it and take it as an opportunity to mention that book. So he takes her to the Morning Woods, and she's kind of trusting him because this whole organization is shadowy. It's mysterious. There's some question about who even knows it exists. How far up does that go? For example, does the president know it's there, or does it stop with the Pentagon? There's mention of a real world issue with the Pentagon constantly failing their audits by billions of dollars that are just missing entirely. So I think, there's maybe some real world question about does something like this, maybe not a whole agency, but, research or defenses or something that they're not being fully upfront about. Crazy concept, or there may be just some corrupt people siphoning off where they can. That's not what this podcast is about. We're talking about my story. So Jennings is skeptical, even though she encountered the owl, and now she's involved in this shadowy organization. If we learned anything about Jennings in the story The Owl, we know that she is highly curious, but not in a sort of skeptical way. She's not wondering things. She takes action. She doesn't sit around questioning. She just investigates. So it kind of tracks that, she's curious what this guy is doing. He also has, the authority of being the commander. So there's multiple reasons why she just goes along with this weird little trip he takes her on. So, and I also used their walk through the woods as the vehicle for explaining the bigger concepts. And I explained as much as I could without making it just seem like Graham was word vomiting all of this. I didn't want it to. I still wanted it to be a story, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So as much as he could explain through dialogue, he did. And where some of the parts are still vague, it's because they're still a little vague in my mind, and I'll be specific here in a second. But I want to take this opportunity to sort of walk through some of the things he mentioned, explain a little bit more in depth, just so that maybe you understand where I'm coming from. And I will also do this within stories going forward. We'll do some more deeper exploration of these ideas. But let's just kind of go through. I made a list here. We'll walk through it together. So starting with kind of the half-truth that Graham tells Jennings at the end of The Owl about it coming up out of the ground. He acknowledges that that's something that is partially true maybe, but that he has to unwind some maybe white lies that he might have told her, or that other people might have even told her in her training before they really knew she was going to be invested and they could trust her. Now, in reality, that was also me walking it back, because at the time that I wrote and published The Owl, none of this was on my mind. I had no idea that people would even want to hear from Crystal Jennings again. So I had none of these plans, and so I had to walk that concept back a little bit. And I was very careful in this episode not to set up anything uber specific that I'm going to have to walk back again, because I think it's obvious to a lot of people. It certainly is when you're watching, I think when like a TV series or something, the classic, what was the show where it was all a dream thing? Was it Dallas? I know there was a famous show back, probably a generation before me, maybe a couple, where there was a whole season that built up to something, and then like the first episode of the following season, the character wakes up and the whole past season was a dream. I can't believe I'm forgetting what show it was now. I haven't watched it myself, but I know that's like a famous example of just noticeably bad writing. So that's not something I want to do frequently, if at all. So just want to acknowledge that real quick. So yeah, we kind of, that's also the introduction that Graham uses to like, now I'm going to explain what's really going on. And now we get into the new concepts. So they're called the Warning Woods because the agency monitors them for this activity, as Graham describes, the kind of the pulse of the two dimensions. And as they're closer together near this fissure, there's an increase in things crossing over. The agency monitors this activity. Again, I was not super specific with that because I don't quite think I've settled on what exactly they're monitoring or how they're monitoring it. But I do think it's actually safe to say that the agency, at the time Graham forced Jennings to go through the portal, would have been aware that happened. There would have been someone else outside that knew this was going on, and Graham just was banking on being able to do it quick enough to not be interrupted. And he's also, he's on this compressed timeline. His life's work is, it's kind of at this boiling point. He's got this recruit that he thinks is promising, but he doesn't personally have that much time left. And he's trying to hurry this process along so that he can get his answers before he's crossing over. So he's a bit of a complicated character. He's both trying to serve his duty and also himself in some selfish ways. And so basically, yeah, we've got these two, I mentioned the pulse, these two parallel dimensions that are sort of pulsing and, occasionally getting close to each other. And where the barrier is thin, we see these spirits appearing. Where it's broken, they're crossing through. There was a brief mention in the story. Graham kind of compares this parallel dimension thing to like the digital world, how it exists, right? Like it's a real thing that we interact with constantly. I guess, but maybe by digital world, I should specify. Let's be really specific with internet. The internet is real. It's something that we all, obviously, if you're listening to this podcast right now, we all engage with it. This podcast is real, right? My voice is real, but what you're engaging with is not actually, the sound coming out of my mouth right now in this current moment that I'm recording. You have this echo of it that exists. It's real, but you can't touch it, you can't taste it, you can't smell it. You can hear it, but what you're even hearing isn't the same sound wave that I'm producing right now. You're hearing a recreation of it. What is that? When you're not listening to it, what is it? How does it exist? It's not something that you can sense at all, right? And if you're a super techie person, I know you're probably going to leave a comment about exactly what it is. I know there's a physical element to the internet as well, but for the general person interacting with other people, viewing things, listening to things on the internet, I think it's a good comparison for how I'm imagining these things. They're both existing at the same time. They're both real, but they're not the same sort of tangible places. I don't know. It's complicated, right? If you've seen the movie Interstellar, you might have a little bit of an idea for this whole concept of the dimension. Interstellar does a good job of portraying how time is like the fourth dimension. So basically, and I had to do a lot of research. It took me a long time to kind of mold this concept in a way that would not be immediately against any known science. Fiction is fun because you get to occasionally bend the truth here and there, certainly create facts for the world that you're creating, but it loses some of its, and for me at least, it loses some of its power when it is directly contradictory to things that we know, unless that's like the entire concept. Like if you're going to write a movie about, gravity stops working and suddenly there's no gravity, well, that could be a cool movie. But if you just are writing a romance and gravity just doesn't exist, this is obviously a ridiculous example, but maybe you see what I mean. If you're completely contradicting a known and generally accepted concept, there's more resistance, I think, to accepting the story. So I try to walk the line between fiction and known or established science. The spiritual world makes that pretty easy to walk the line because there's not a lot of scientific information at all about the spiritual world. But I digress. So think about, you can travel basically like we have the three obvious dimensions. There's length, width, and height, longitude, latitude, and altitude. You can travel up, you can go forward, but, and I'm talking physically, but what if you could move in a different way, like to a whole plane that we can't see right now, and I think that's kind of what it seems like maybe psychedelics do. If you're somebody who's experienced that, I never have actually. This story made me think I probably should before I get too deep into this, but I've never done that. But I have listened to lots of stories about from people who have explained kind of the visuals and how it feels to visit these kind of psychedelic places, and also like the weird connections. A lot of people have the same experience. If you want to, I think you could probably find a clip of it. There's an episode of the Joe Rogan podcast where he's talking to Mike Tyson, and they talk about a lot of these things. They're just sort of interesting. So maybe that's sort of an example of what I'm talking about, a way to move sort of directionally in a direction that we can't measure with our current tools. But there's this plant that maybe allows your brain to move through this dimension. It's hard to differentiate too. The term dimension can be used, I think maybe this comes from science fiction to describe a place, sort of like I've done here, like lots of people before me have. But it's also, like the you think about like the dimensions of a box, its length, width, height. And maybe I'm just not smart enough to understand how those things are the same. But to me, it seems like there's two different uses for the term, and I use them both sort of at the same time because as I researched this stuff, that was kind of the way everyone seemed to be doing it, even in the scientific papers and things. Anyway, essentially, so things that we might consider spirits are beings that exist on this other plane. And it's kind of like, think about like, again, going back to the digital world thing, think about like video game characters they exist in that world, but they don't really exist in ours, right? But what if there was a way that characters in a video game could cross over to our world where we exist? Would they come out looking the same? This is a bit of a tough example because video game characters, at least if you're playing a game with humans in it, they're already kind of made to look like humans. So this might actually be a poor example. We'll leave that there. But anyway, the creatures that are on the other side, they have to take a form that can function in our environment. Jumping ahead a little bit, Crystal sees Graham's spirit, and it's basically like this prism of light that is sort of floating in the ether and then falls to join this moving train. Train's not the right word, but this moving belt of spirits below. So clearly, he made a transition going over to that side. The same thing happens when spirits come over to our world. They have to take on a form that allows them to exist and function here. So maybe that means they need to breathe, fly, eat, that sort of thing. But it also explains why a lot of times, and he mentions like the Wendigo and skinwalkers, it explains why they also still have some supernatural abilities. They're physical monsters that will chase somebody through the woods, but they also have these otherworldly abilities and powers that come from being this other type of entity that's from this other dimension. So they bring with them some of that supernatural ability, but they also are limited to a form that they can function in here on Earth. It gets a little bit fuzzier with the demons and things like that, which he mentions briefly, talking about demons and angels. I didn't get super deep into some of the more religious spirits like demons and angels. Particularly, I'm thinking about, why, if these are not like the classic demons and angels from heaven and hell, sort of like think about like the monotheistic religions. If they're not those, which Graham seems to explain that they're not, why do things like holy water and exorcisms work? Why are priests recognized by these things, the good or the evil ones? I'm still kind of working through that particular branch of this concept. I have the general idea, but I wasn't quite ready to fully express it yet. Again, because I don't want to walk things back later on. Essentially, I want every type of spirit that we encounter in this genre, I guess, demons, ghosts, angels, cryptid type stuff. I wanted to find a way that all of it could exist in the same universe and have it all make sense. So working on kind of threading together the last few pieces of that. So I kept the demon and angel stuff vague, but I will recall your attention to a story that I did a couple years ago now called Angels, where there's this weird disappearance of a town. I am currently planning the revisitation of that story. And the angels that appear may actually be angels. So that brings us to, wow, I just kind of organically went through half of my notes in order. So cool. We're tracking well here. Inside the fissure, I mentioned kind of the psychedelic influence on this world. I love the idea of this other dimension sort of being the fabric of all of our souls sort of tied together, that we're all part of a bigger collective functioning as one. It certainly feels that way. I think you can feel when the larger consciousness shifts. I mentioned the kind of the stress of 2020, the various factors behind that in this story. And Graham implies that was due to this pulse of these dimensions coming together. And I feel like, that was something that a lot of the stuff, I'm writing fiction, I'm making this up, but that's something I really do kind of believe in, because it's so weird how you can just kind of feel the tension of everybody around you. And some of it I think is obviously pretty practical. Like when something like a pandemic is going on and everybody's stressed out, you go to the grocery store, you see nobody's smiling, they're moving around frantically, being aggressive. There's things you can detect that I think are just primal instincts. But, then you get home and it's like you still feel everybody's stress. Even if you're not, like, I tried not to be online a whole lot during that time, and I still just kind of felt like I had a general sense of how everybody, in a time that, excuse me, in a time that everyone was completely isolated. I was basically around nobody but my family, immediate family, my wife and daughter. That was it for a long time. And I still kind of could just feel everybody. So that's kind of what I'm talking about with this fabric that everybody's a part of. To some extent, it's tied to everybody. Now, getting into kind of the Warning Woods concept, this opens the door to things like reincarnation. Obviously we talked about ghosts crossing through where there's not necessarily a crack, a fissure, but there's these like stress marks where the barrier is weakened and thinner. So they're kind of visually crossing over. They're interacting in a less direct way than something like the owl can. We've opened the door to all of these different types of concepts by having the other dimension being sort of where the soul comes from and where it returns to. It's tied to our world, but it's not existing in the same way. Visually, this was sort of difficult to construct and describe. I ended up leaning on, some of you may laugh, if you want to see exactly where I landed and kind of was able to construct the visuals, look up the music video to Vicarious by Tool, one of my all-time favorite bands, possibly my all-time favorite band. I hesitate to say that, but definitely top 5. Vicarious is one of my favorite songs by them, and it has this beautiful psychedelic kind of music video that goes with it. Skip to like 6 minutes and 20 seconds if you want to see exactly the image that I had in my mind as I was building this. And I changed things. There's all these faces in the music video. I don't have the faces. But like, if you just want to get a general idea of what I was trying to imagine here, check that out. Maybe you already are familiar with it and you know what I'm talking about. And also just enjoy it. It's a fantastic song by a great band. Okay, so that kind of, we can walk away from that part of the story now. Let's talk about the encounter with the owl. And this was fun. This was, this moment was kind of for the fans. This was for you all. I didn't originally have it in the story, and then the idea occurred to me, and I was like, well, let's try it out. Jennings acknowledges that she doesn't think it actually happens in either of the worlds. It's kind of in this weird in-between purgatory, and that might mean it's happening in her mind. That's how I interpreted it as I was writing it. You are welcome to imagine differently if it is more enjoyable for you. But this was a mental test. This was, or maybe not mental, this was sort of a spiritual test for Jennings, because she goes into this a skeptic, and she doesn't really know if she believes the paranormal side of things. The owl was a very physical being, so she doesn't really have to believe in ghosts or demons or angels to still, have and respect her memory of this thing that happened to her. She doesn't need any of that to explain the owl. And obviously, at the point where she's crossed over into this other dimension and she's floating, she doesn't have a body, she clearly has no chance of disbelief anymore. Like she's there, it's right in front of her. And beyond doubting herself, which Crystal Jennings does not seem like someone to doubt herself, she has to accept that this is a real thing. And therefore, now the door is open for everything Graham said to be true. She obviously can't trust him as a person, but there's no reason for him to lie about any of that other stuff, right? But now she has to deal with the fact that the owl, this thing that killed so many people in her town, killed her friend Andy, the journalist from that story, she has to cope with the fact that that thing came from this other dimension and that it could potentially come again, or at least some form of it. So while this other stuff is now real and it's fascinating, she has to battle with this new knowledge of this thing that has haunted her. And literally, she has to battle with it in her mind. Whether this is just a side effect of her crossing over or some sort of trance that she enters, she deals with this mental battle with the owl. And like I said, I kind of wrote this just for the fans. You have the theme music playing there as she's finally conquering it. There's some symbolism there as she uses the owl against itself and completely dominates it to escape. This is a moment where she can now leave the owl in the past. She's defeated it physically, she's defeated it mentally, and she's able to move on to the next thing, which we will find out what it is at a later date. I don't want to spoil it now, but Jennings is going to serve a pretty specific role in the Warning Woods universe going forward that I think will be very fun. I will say this, we have Gabby Pons, who's kind of the spiritualist talking to ghosts and things. We have the Whitney brothers, who are the ghost hunters. They're investigating what usually ends up being more evil entities. So we kind of have those two serving a similar but different role. Jennings is going to also have a role that I've assigned her. And there's at least one more story that has to happen with her involving the HPA before we can really get into that. I am currently plotting and planning that story because I also wanted to include some more details about this larger world. So she's not coming back immediately. You're not going to hear from her next week, but it will not be another year before we hear from Crystal Jennings again. I promise you that. All right. So, quickly I should mention too, because there was a couple questions about the timing of like the agents coming 4 years later. Obviously, because the time dilation, Jennings goes from 2021 to the beginning of 2025. So why did the agents show up there? Well, remember that the whole idea of the Warning Woods is that it is being monitored by the agency to be used as a warning. Like when things heat up at the Warning Woods, things are going to heat up worldwide, most likely. The dimensions are close together. So they're monitoring these woods. They're also aware that Graham essentially kidnapped Jennings and forced her into the fissure. So we can imagine that they're watching, and when she comes back through, they get there and help her out. That's why they showed up. I didn't explicitly outline that in the story. Personally, I obviously didn't feel like I needed to. So if you're confused about that, that's the explanation there. Okay. I'm going to stop here. This will be the end of the public part of this episode. If you want to hear the rest, go to patreon.com/thewarningwoods. You can become a free member of The Warned for a week. You get a 7-day trial where you can listen to the rest of this episode, and you can listen to as many Into the Woods episodes as you like. Patrons get the podcast on Tuesday nights at 8 p.m. Central Standard Time. So over 24 hours before everybody else, they get to listen ad-free. They get these bonus episodes, and every story also comes with a PDF of the story fully written out and the artwork for the story. So plus, I'm very responsive to comments and messages in Patreon. I try to do a little bit, on YouTube and Instagram and stuff like that too, but I make it a real effort to respond to every comment and message there. So if you're somebody who wants to interact with me, asking questions, just leaving general comments, whatever it is, that's a really good way for you to connect with me. But don't think that I'm trying to exclude people who are not patrons. You can always reach out to me at thewarningwoods@gmail.com. You can message me on Instagram. However you choose to get hold of me, I do my best to respond to everybody. But patrons are kind of my priority because they're really invested in this show. And it's a valuable thing for you all too, the Patreon community, because I use, or at least I as often as I can, I try to use all the Patreon funds for podcast improvements. So for example, I've been saving for a while, and last month I got a really great sort of the entry tier professional level audio interface. So if you've noticed a difference in audio quality for the last couple weeks, that is why. You can thank the Patreon community for that. So yeah, that's all I wanted to say about that. If you want to check it out, like I said, there's a 7-day free trial at at patreon.com/thewarningwoods. So check that out. All right. Take care, everybody.